You are listening to the FORSCOM Frontline, bringing you to our soldiers on the front lines of readiness.
Hello everyone, welcome to FORSCOM Frontline. I'm Dean and I'm your host today. We've spent a lot of time talking about every aspect of readiness in our episodes this year, so we wanted to change it up a bit. Today I'm excited to introduce you to one of FORSCOM's chaplains. Chaplain David Curlin is the FORSCOM Chief of Operations and Sustainment Chaplain. He commissioned as an infantry officer in 1990, following his first assignment in Vicenza, Italy. Did 6 years of missionary service in Albania, which I'm excited to talk about a bit. He returned to active duty in 2003 as an Army Chaplain endorsed by the Anglican Church of North America. But the reason we wanted to introduce you to Chaplain Curlin is because of his unique delivery. Take a listen.
All right. Who you going to call when you're down and feeling blue? Who you going to call when you don't know what to do? Who you going to call when life has lost its meaning? Who you going to call when everyone is screaming? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when your joy is great unbounded? Who you going to call when you find your fears unfounded? Who you going to call when you have good news to share? Who you going to call when you had a little scare? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when you miss that prized promotion? Who you going to call when your life is all commotion? Who you going to call when your kids just make you mad? Who you going to call when your spouse has made you sad? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when you're looking for communion? Who you going to call when you've had a sweet reunion? Who you going to call when your heart just wants to sing? Who you going to call when you want your tithe to bring? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when you have an SIR? Who you going to call when you don't know where you are? Who you going to call when doubt just plagues your mind? Who you going to call when the answer you just can't find? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call if you think faith's but a joke? Who you going to call if your religion's being woke? Who you going to call if you're a skeptic through and through? Who you going to call if the chaplain's not for you? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when the battle begins to rage? Who you going to call when you're locked up in a cage? Who you going to call when you come up on the blotter? Who you going to call when they say you're profile fodder? Call your chaplain. Who you going to call when the doctor shakes his head? Who you going to call when you're dying in your bed? Who you going to call when the tears begin to flow? Who you going to call when they say it's time to go? Call your chaplain. Epilogue. And if your chaplain can't fit the bill, take a moment and be still. Lift your eyes to God above. He will shelter you in his love. The chaplain represents the king. The chaplain's not the end, the thing. So join your chaplains in daily prayer. Their God does hear you, this I swear. Be blessed, FORSCOM, from your chaplain section. God be with you till the resurrection. And all God's people said, Amen.
So the first time we spoke to Chaplain Curlin, we were excited and wanted to get him on the podcast. So thank you, Chaplain, for doing this.
Yeah.
Taking the time. We hope to get to know you a little bit more after this episode of the podcast.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So let's just start with tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you end up becoming an Army Chaplain? Because I don't think that was the MOS you actually joined.
No, it wasn't. And so, like probably most people today, we don't always end up where we thought we would end up. As a child, I read a lot of missionary biographies, and they were these amazing stories of men and women going into the jungles of the world and risking their lives to share the love of God with people. And so as a young boy, I decided, that's what I want to do. I want to be a missionary. And I didn't really waver from that. I was on my way to college, and I was visiting the college where I would attend my senior year, and there was an ROTC table. And they asked me if I wanted to apply for a scholarship. And I said, what's ROTC? And I go, Reserve Officer Training. So I filled out the packet, and lo and behold, got a scholarship, which changed my trajectory for a little bit. I ended up commissioning as an infantry officer, going and serving with 3rd of the 325 in Vicenza, Italy. John Abizade, who later became, the CENTCOM commander, was my first battalion commander. But that was a great experience. And while I was there, I found out about Albania. And so that renewed that early call. And so I decided to resign my commission once I had completed my commitment and go work as a missionary in Albania. The walls had just fallen during that time, and so it was the Wild West. It really met that bill for adventure. So was in Albania for several years, And it was while I was serving in Albania, fairly happily, that the Army reached out to me through email and asked if I was interested in becoming an Army chaplain. This was early 2002. And, I said, no, not interested. But I later had a friend call me and said, David, being a chaplain's real missionary work. They got their own language, their own culture. I encourage you to think about it. There's some great opportunities for a chaplain. And so planted the seed, and about 6 months later, I wrote back that email again. I didn't know who I was writing to. I'm like, hey, you reached out to me. I'm interested in being a chaplain. And so the rest is history. I ended up actually flying over from Albania for my interview, my chaplain interview, and began as a chaplain in 2003.
So off topic though, you mentioned about being in Vicenza, Italy. Was there any awesome sights you got to see while you were there?
Yeah, as you know, Vicenza is right between Verona and Venice. I think it's about 30 minutes from each, and so those are of course amazing places. And then you're an hour and a half from the Italian Alps, and only about 2 hours from the Swiss Alps, and you have some of the best beaches in the world, and Rome is 5 hours away. It was an amazing experience.
So, all right, back on topic. Okay, so you've got a unique way of delivering invocations. Can you talk about how that all started?
Yeah, so, the chaplains and the many staff meetings that occur, chaplains are often the staff officer that maybe doesn't have a specified role that they're briefing. And so, I imagine it began well, but many chaplains experience the word of the day as a somewhat patronizing moment. Give the chaplain his moment so he's not the only one who doesn't have anything to say. And so from the earliest, from my first few months in the Army, I wrestled with how do I say something that's relevant in what's generally a short time. They want you to speak in maybe a minute to a minute and a half. And so like many people, I began with the old dead guy quotes. And I was like, I didn't feel very good. It just felt really, really like I was falling into that patronizing kind of sense. And so I tried different things. I tried a song here and there and tried to create some stuff and had some success here and there, but really never got it. And when I went to Korea, the commander there said, we're not going to have the chaplain speak. Because the guy before, great guy, but was doing old dead guy quotes. And he's like, hey, we don't really need that. So my boss, Dave Bolus, who's over at USASOC, he said, hey, give me a chance and I will, and if you don't like what I do, then I'll put it up. Long story short, he figured out how to do a sermon in a minute and a half with a great illustration, and I can't go into all that, but he kind of recovered the moment. So it went from, we'll give the chaplain a token moment once a week, to chaplain, will you speak every time? People were waiting on the edge of their seat for the chaplains to share. And so we're like, wow, every day, that's wiping us out. So we ended up kind of settling it twice a week. But when the rhyme began was, my buddy came up to me, a guy named Eric Dean, Chaplain Eric Dean. He said, Dave, I dare you to do the word of the day, Corona be gonna. And so I tried, but it was kind of serious. It was Korea. They were taking it very serious. I wrestled with Corona Bigona, but I couldn't quite pull it off. But I said, let me try some of this other rhyme and meter. And so I began. And it just was met with rave reviews. And so I started. I'm like, wow, that was kind of nice to get that much response. And I began to do it there, typically the word of the day. And then one time I said, I wonder if I do an invocation in rhyme and meter. And again, it hit the mark. People were listening. It was, normally when people do an invocation, like, that was nice, Chaplain. You said something about God, and anyways, thank you. But this one it was totally different. People would respond and go, wow, that was so personal. And that was, that was very memorable. That was one of the highlights of the whole service. And so I've just kind of stuck with it. And I still try to vary it up some so it's not all rhyme and meter.
Right.
But rhyme and meter works. And then the final thing is, you can say a lot of things in rhyme and meter that you can't say if you try to use prose. And that is, you can address more difficult topics, but because it's in a poetic form, people's defenses are down and they're not as resistant. And so you can address topics that you otherwise wouldn't address if you use rhyme and meter.
So you mentioned about poetry then. Was there any kind of background in poetry, things you read or wrote?
As a kid, no real strong background in poetry. Though I had some poems that I liked here and there. But as a kid, I loved Dr. Seuss books, as you know, who picks up the alliteration and the rhyme. And then I loved Uncle Remus. My mom would read all these Uncle Remus stories, and he also had a real alliteration and a gift with language. So I love stories that picked up the sound of language. And I had that as a boy. I guess when I was a kid, the first rappers were like Run DMC and the others. So I remember they were telling stories, right, in rhyme and meter. And I always thought that was really attractive. And I guess that combination of kind of the rap, the Uncle Remus, Dr. Seuss all kind of came together to come up with my own kind of style.
So have you done this in front of a large congregation, or has it been?
I have. I've done it, but I've never done like a full, because it's a little more work, right? So, I mean, to go for, let's say, a 15-minute homily in rhyme and meter, I haven't done that. But, when you ask me that question, I'm like, I'm going to try that here. I'm going to do the hard work to do it. I've done sections, so I'll break off, and I often will open up with an introduction with a poem. And again, you find you just hook people right away, and then you get to spend the next 12 to 14 minutes unpacking kind of the meat of what you said in the first minute, which really hooks people. So I'll begin with a poem, and then conclude with the same idea after I've unpacked it. And I've had a lot of people say they really like it.
It almost sounds like a play. It's kind of, I don't want to say a song and dance, but you're kind of
working
through the crowd and
it is
seeing how they respond, and then
it really is. I think,
along.
And from years of doing words of the day and invocations, where you saw it's just not touching anybody. It's not that people were actually physically resistant so much, although that occasionally happened. But it was just a sense that I'm speaking irrelevance. Nobody's listening, and it's not because they're bad. It's just the mode. It's not engaging people. And I've found that this mode is much more engaging. There's some people who've criticized it. They're like, hey, that's sacrilegious. Are you trying to show off? And that's fair for them to do that. But my comment has been, no, I'm not trying to do either one of those. I'm trying to connect. I don't want to talk into thin air. I'd like to leave a deposit that people remember and that can, be of encouragement. And so for the most part, I think probably 95% it's been encouragement.
So there's always people that don't like change.
Yeah.
But is it more positive for an older crowd, or negative? Is it is there one specific where you kind of go, yeah, maybe this isn't the right crowd?
For the most part, it's actually been a fairly universal applause. Like I said, I've heard a few voices, gotten a stray email here and there that was a little sacrilegious. Though that's certainly, I try to avoid that. You could be, but I'm conscious of not wanting to say anything that's not true or that's demeaning or that portrays God in a flippant light. I would never want to do that. But I think it's been again, I went years and hardly got any comments, and then all of a sudden I went to this, and every time that I use this medium, I'll get 5 or 6 or more people through emails and others saying, wow, thank you, that was really good.
So what do your fellow chaplains think of this?
I've had a lot of people say, wow, I would love to do that. I think part of it's personality, and so you don't want to be who you can't be somebody that you're not. And maybe because I'm kind of loud and I'm kind of out there kind of person, I can do it with maybe more authenticity than someone else who might have the skill. It's not very hard once you get it. And then, of course, you can go on the computer, and people are like, oh, you got such a big vocabulary. I'm like, I go to Rhyme Finder. I start doing it, just pull it up. So it's not a very hard medium to use, but I think it has to be true to who you are. And like I said, I've always been a storyteller. I spent hours reading the Dr. Seuss books, both to my little brothers and sisters. I still love them myself. And I like this mode. The good rap artists, when they really lay a good, whether it's Kanye or whatever, I still love that medium of effective communication. You're my Chick-fil-A. I mean, that just, every time I get that, I think of God. And it's like a simple thing, closed on Sundays, this idea of giving glory to God. And so I've just tried to translate that into a military context and use it.
That's awesome. I'm moving down. I'm trying to.
Great.
So we came into this episode conversation asking about your story. I guess we'd be a little remiss if we didn't ask you what available resources that chaplains provide to soldiers and their families.
So chaplains have a really unique role. One of the great attractions of the chaplain corps, particularly the Army, is the Army uses the chaplain as the frontline provider. We're the first responder. So whatever your problem, it is a cultural phenomenon in the military that you'll often be sent to your chaplain. And, that can be met with, well, I'm not religious. And increasingly, commanders say, we don't care if you're religious, the chaplain will tell you where to go. Commanders and others don't have the time to be up on every resource the Army offers. And the chaplain is expected to have the wherewithal in the background to take those people, whatever their problem may be, and point them in the right direction. So some people, they want a particular, actually a very small minority of people want a specifically religious answer to their problem.
Okay.
A greater percentage are looking for wisdom, and chaplains are usually pretty good resources of what I would say wisdom literature, the kind of things that that you gain just from living a few years. The average starting age for a chaplain is 37. So we're almost a generation older than the soldiers that we serve. You learn a lot if you're paying attention in that, and so chaplains give a lot of just that life counsel. And then, as I said, we are expected to know all the other resources the Army has, and we're expected to be able to pass people out to the psychologist or to mental health or to go get a finance class at ACS or to go to whatever hotline or where to go if they need to, they're frustrated because their spouse can't find a job. We're expected to know what's in the community and be able to point people in the right direction.
Now, it's great to be able to have the resources. You find it, if you had that background, maybe you went to school for that, mental health or something like that, would be more helpful, or do you think it would be kind of get in the way?
That's a good question. And one of the surprises that chaplains find in the Army, on the outside, mental health providers and the clergy can sometimes be at odds. We come with oftentimes it is assumed that we come with different presuppositions. However, that's not true in the Army. For whatever reason, the mental health providers in the Army and the chaplains get along quite well. And I don't sense, in general, an antagonism toward the spiritual perspective of our mental health providers. As you know, there are more chaplains than there are mental health providers.
Oh, I did not know that.
There are. And so mental health folks get overwhelmed. Oftentimes there'll be one for a brigade where there'll be like 7 or 8 chaplains, and they're getting the hardest cases, right? I mean, if the chaplain's passing off someone to you, it's because, man, he doesn't want anything to do with it. It's like one of those almost intractable cases. So they have oftentimes, I think, a more demanding and difficult job.
Yeah.
I would say that one reason that chaplains continue, it may change and probably is changing, but one reason chaplains get more traffic than mental health folks is typically mental health treats you as a patient. Chaplains treat you as a fellow struggler. I've been there. So you're not a patient, you're just somebody getting counsel from an older brother or a father figure or, a sister. And I think that makes the chaplain more accessible. It doesn't feel... you don't feel like a patient.
Right,
and I think
right.
people are reluctant to feel like patients. Though, for those who do that, I mean, again, our mental health folks are wonderful.
So what would be misconceptions then people think about chaplain? Because that
So
plays
I
perfectly
think
into
that
that.
the big misconception, and it's not always a misconception. I mean, it's happened enough that they're... Let me back up. So a lot of people have been burned by their religious communities in life. It is remarkable when you start going and listening to the stories of soldiers, how many people have a very bad experience with their church, with their youth leader, with their spiritual parents. I mean, you name it. There are a lot more negative stories than there are positive stories. So that's sad. And obviously, as a chaplain, you represent in some way that bad experience. And there are a handful of chaplains that reinforce that. But by and large, the chaplain corps today, it's better than it's ever been in its history. We have more sharp men and women who are feeling the call. I think part of it is because of the decline of the church in America. The church is really experiencing some hard times. So that, I think, opens up a larger pool of very gifted people who want to come in and serve as chaplains. And so the misconceptions that exist is that your chaplain's going to be like that bad old whoever who, you grew up in, who's going to look out at the world and declare its sins and how terrible everybody is. I think most chaplains are increasingly good listeners. I think they are oftentimes willing to hear people's stories and withhold comment unless asked for a comment. And so I think many people are reluctant to go and receive the help that a chaplain could get because they've had a bad prior experience and they cast that perception onto the chaplain, whoever he or she may be. I think once that's overcome, a lot of people are surprised at what good guides, friends, and counselors chaplains are.
So I guess with the whole Corona Be Gone thing, was it a lot more difficult for you to get together with the congregation, or was it?
It was.
So I mean, what is it? How do you get the word out there?
So I mean, this is probably common knowledge, but the church in America lost 20% of its people.
Wow.
I mean, that's a huge 2-year loss, almost without precedent. The loss was bigger than that, but some people think it may be a permanent loss of 20% of the people. As you know, one of the big attractions of the church, one of the big draws is community. And if you can't come together, you can't have community. I mean, this is going to be a good medium, right? This is better than anybody reading an article here, but it's not going to be like sitting around with friends. And the church having that 2-year period where, almost a full year where churches were highly restricted, not allowed to meet together, people went and found other outs.
Right.
And so it damaged the church significantly. The church is still dealing with that damage. And then this is the irony. When the church is damaged, the communities are damaged. Because I don't know of any other part in our American culture or any other culture that brings as diverse a group of people together as the church does and builds community. And so I think as a nation, as the church has declined, and not just the church, but community events, if you look at military-based organizations, this younger generation's not a part of them in a way that the older generation was.
Yeah.
We ultimately, I think we're going to see that it's a bitter fruit over time because communities solve so many problems. And we know whether it's suicide or most of the problems that we're trying to get at after the Army, they're community breakdown problems. And so, yes, it did hurt the church. And
are there any, so change subject.
Yeah.
We talked about the resources earlier. I've been off script for a while now, but anyway, so some of the online resources, is there any online resources, websites or something specific that people can check out or?
Off the top of my head, I can't give you the exact digital address. But
we can probably post them in the notes, or I can put them on the screen.
Okay. I think that one of the amazing realities of the modern world is there is no topic of interest that is not available for free somewhere on the internet. I mean, whether it's TED Talks, whether it is Christian community online, whether it's apologetics, which is the defense of Christianity, or Islam, or Buddhism, pick whatever you want to do it. There's somebody out there giving you high quality material to help you deal with your problems. Diet, exercise, marriage relationship advice. It is all there. And so I think the big problem with us moderns is we're drowning in the deluge of information.
Yeah.
And the reality is you have to narrow your focus onto information to have any benefit from it. So if you're, drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, you can't drink anything, right? There's too much coming at you. And I think that we have a serious challenge in the modern world that we have such a flow of information that people don't process anything. And so they get numb to it, so to speak. And then they just go distract themselves. Let me just go watch YouTube videos of whatever, bike crashes, motorcycle crashes, whatever it is.
Cats falling down or something.
Exactly. Because there is a sense of I can't process all the information.
Yeah. So I think we covered a lot. Is there anything maybe you want to talk about that I haven't gone over? I'm sure there's a million things.
I think the main point that I would like to get across to the broader audience is don't be passive in your pursuit of truth. Pursue truth. Almost all the people we remember from antiquity were people who took very seriously trying to figure out what is the nature of reality, what is true, what is good, what is right. What does it mean to live your life well? If you're just absorbing kind of from sitcoms and TV shows and the general milieu of TV, talk TV, you're not going to absorb a lot of wisdom. And life is comfortable enough now. There's generally enough money that people can live in climate control. Get to the TV or the computer or whatever with their box of Doritos and M&Ms and just kind of like veg out your life away. That blue pill from the Matrix that you could take. You can take the blue pill today. In fact, I would say increasingly larger numbers of people are taking the blue pill. And so I preach it to myself, and I would want to challenge anybody out there in the listening audience. Take seriously thinking deeply about the nature of truth, reality, and meaning. And then my final caveat to that is, Jesus told the story when people were thinking, how judgmental we should be. How much should we help our neighbor to see the truth? He said, I just got one piece of advice for you. Take the plank out of your eye before you get the speck out of your neighbor's. And I think as a culture, as a person, every one of us can benefit from learning to do a lot more listening, from being much more self-aware of our own issues, being much more generous with other people. Because if you're pursuing truth and wisdom, you need to have a high degree of self-awareness of all the junk you're bringing to the table and be less concerned about, the specks in other people's eyes.
Well, Chaplain, appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It's been a pleasure. I hope a lot of people got something out of this episode. I know I did.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks.